Today, we're really happy to have Dr. Gregg Sanford from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. It's going to talk about resilience and soil health.
Well, thank you very much. I think that my talk was originally called Soil Health and Resilience, and I've tweaked it a bit to call it Soil Health and Climate Resilience, this idea that these can be co-benefits of sustainable or regenerative agroecosystems. And I just want to acknowledge the kind of colleagues and co-authors on the work that I'm going to be presenting on. Eric Booth, Valentin Picasso, and Randy Jackson, all in the agronomy department at the UW, have contributed to this work. The data we're going to be looking at today come from the Wisconsin Integrated Cropping Systems Trial. This is a long-term, large-scale cropping systems experiment in south central Wisconsin. And I'm just going to say right out of the bat that there, I think, is a lot of interesting information on our website for the people that are here, past soil health research that's been done. It's all accessible through there, and a way to contact us if you have questions after today's chat. The trial has, actually 9 systems, but we have 6 core systems. And the way that it was designed was that those core systems were built to represent kind of standard cash grain rotations in the north central US or the Midwest. So we've got continuous corn, no-till corn, soybean, an organic corn, soy, wheat rotation. And then we have a set of dairy forage rotations typical for livestock production systems in the area. So we've got conventional alfalfa corn systems, an organic alfalfa corn system, and then one rotationally grazed pasture system. So kind of a big thing to consider when we're talking about the data that we look at from WICST is just the fact that this is a systems experiment. It's not a factorial kind of assessment of nitrogen or tillage. We're looking at the whole integrated system. And so we have to rely on some of the gradients that we have at the trial. For instance, if you look from kind of left to right here, we have systems that are increasingly diverse, that is, they go from monocultures or simple rotations to more complex rotations. And then we have this gradient of increasing perenniality from completely annual systems to completely perennial systems. And so we use those management gradients to kind of parse and make sense of the data from these trials. Things like how much living cover do we have? How much tillage is there? What is the relative perenniality of a system? This kind of combination of living cover and limited tillage. And then, what kind of species diversity or crop diversity are we working with? So I know that this group is, focused on soil health. So I just want to kind of begin this discussion with, something that at WICST is really kind of pretty firmly established. And that's simply that diversity and perenniality improve soil health in these systems. And I think that, that's borne out in many studies beyond southern Wisconsin. There have been a number of past experiments, past publications or research at WICST that have looked at various assays of soil health or metrics of soil health. And I just want to show you kind of how those line up with respect to those systems gradients at the trial. So all of the figures that I show to you today are going to follow a similar kind of look, if you will. You can see in the bottom right corner of the screen, the systems at WICST. We have continuous corn, soybean, wheat, which is organic, corn with 3 years of alfalfa, and then corn, oats, alfalfa, which is organic, and then pasture. That color coding will be consistent. And so just kind of showing you that kind of connection between soil health and system metrics. Work that I published in 2012, looking at total carbon in these systems. If we take that and kind of retroactively look at systems gradients, we see that soil carbon at the trial is very strongly correlated with the amount of living cover at Wixt. Anna Cates, a colleague, in 2016 published a study looking at different fractions of soil carbon, and perhaps not surprisingly, given that total carbon is associated with living cover, POM carbon, or particulate organic matter carbon, which would be carbon associated with plant detritus, is also strongly correlated with living cover. The Soil Health Institute, in their recent assessment of North American cropping systems, looked at total microbial biomass, and although this data is unpublished, just kind of looking very quickly at it, there is a strong correlation between living cover and microbial biomass. So living cover is playing a key role here in some of our soil health metrics. In 2011, Bill Jokela with the USDA looked at the Wisconsin Integrated Cropping Systems trial and did actually a soil quality index, which was an early kind of soil health assessment. And taking his data on aggregation and water stable aggregates, we see that relative perenniality is very strongly related to water stable aggregation. In that same assessment of soil quality index, Bill Jokela also looked at POX-C, which is an active carbon, kind of indicative of rapidly decomposing organic fraction in the soil, serving as kind of food for the microorganisms in the soil. And that too was strongly related to the diversity of these agricultural systems, so how many crops we have present. So if we look at the suite of things that have been done at Wixt evaluating these systems, we do see that diversity, living cover, perenniality, all push our systems in directions that build soil quality and soil health. And so, the interest in soil health is centered around a suite of ecosystem services that derive from it. And so that's where I'm going to kind of pivot. Hopefully it's a relatively soft pivot from this specific soil health discussion to the current work that we're doing at Wixt, which is looking kind of more broadly at productivity in these systems, but more specifically at the stability of that production and the resilience of that production. And I don't need to remind anybody in this room about the kind of myriad challenges facing us in the 21st century: growing populations, climate change, environmental degradation, loss of kind of the fabric of rural communities. And what's interesting is that when we think about those challenges, we often turn to agroecosystems, our cropping systems, to help us address them. For example, we want our systems to provide us with healthy, abundant food. It would be great if the production of that food was stable, that interannual variability was low, and that as the climate continues to become less predictable, that those systems can help buffer against extreme weather events. Above and beyond those kind of asks of productivity, stability, and resilience, we're also looking to cropping systems to help us stabilize climate. When we start talking about carbon sequestration, the idea of mitigating or attenuating greenhouse gases, and other things like clean water. Before I go any further in the discussion about productivity, stability, and resilience, I just want to run over some terms, mostly because terminology differs to some degree based on different studies and disciplines. And so it's important, I guess, that we start off on the same page. So I have three kind of general graphs here. On the y-axis, we have output, and on the x-axis, we have time. And we can look at the productivity of a system and compare it to another system, and that's relatively straightforward, right? We have systems that are highly productive and systems that are less productive, and Those systems might be changing over time. For example, corn yield has been increasing over the last 50 years, but some systems have lower yielding corn than others. And if we want to evaluate those, we can simply look at the difference between them. With stability, what we're really talking about in the research we're doing right now is kind of the degree of interannual variability in a system. So if a system has a low amount of interannual variability, meaning year to year production is relatively consistent, we have a high degree of stability. If we have a system that fluctuates quite a bit from year to year, we would say that is a system with lower stability. And then resilience, we can think of as kind of a subset of stability, the main difference being that it is in response to some sort of stressor on that system. And so we could have a system that is highly resilient to that stressor, or we could have a system that is less resilient to that stressor. And there are various ways that we can get at those different metrics, but this is the way that we are thinking about it presently in the research ongoing at the trial. I should also just say that resilience typically refers to the reaction to a stressor and then how long a system takes to rebound, because these and there's a lot of annuals involved. A term like resistance or robustness might be more appropriate because the rebound is relatively quick. So how do we compare different systems where we're basically looking at apples to oranges? Our grain systems, we've got corn grain and soybeans and wheat. In our forage systems, we've got corn grain, but we've also got alfalfa haylage and oatlage. And while we have looked at the pasture system just for simplicity today, I'm not going to speak specifically to that. The way that we have brought these systems together in a manner that we can compare them to one another is by basically feeding the output from each cropping system through basically a dairy farm, to some degree through a little bit of industrial processing to get to a metric of food energy. In this case, gigacalories per hectare. The pro to this approach is that it evaluates the whole system. So there's a lot of stability and resilience research out there looking at individual crops in a rotation. This is kind of looking at the whole rotation. A con might be that gross energy output tells us a story of kind of yield per unit area, but in some cases, a net energy output would be more telling. So when we filter the systems through this dairy model and come up with gigacalories per hectare, we get data that looks like this. We have our continuous corn system, our no-till corn soybean system, our organic corn soybean wheat system, and then our conventional and organic forage rotations. And you can see that all of them caloric output has been increasing in time. That is, yields are getting better. Variety development is adding to that, but the scatter around those long-term trends all differ somewhat. So if we're just looking at total output, kind of the comparison of mean yields, our grain systems tend to be the most productive. So those that are dominated by corn and soybeans, followed by our dairy forage systems. So 7 gigacalories per hectare on average, as opposed to 9 gigacalories per hectare. And then our organic grain rotations at 6 gigacalories per hectare. So output is one thing, but again, I think the real piece of interest, particularly with a changing climate and in relation to these soil health metrics, are these questions of stability and resilience. So stability, again, is an assessment of long-term yields and how variable they are. And what we find when we look at our metrics of stability at the trial and compare them to the management gradients we have, forage systems versus grain systems, organic versus conventional, how much tillage, how much living cover, et cetera, we find that relative perenniality is provides the most explanatory information for stability. And if we take a look at that closely, again, with the 5 cash grains, or not 5 cash grain systems, but the 5 field crop systems, we can see that the relationship is quite strong, that we have, with respect to relative perenniality, the kind of low scoring systems are systems that receive a lot of tillage. So in this case, that's our organic grain rotation and our continuous corn rotation. But as the relative perenniality increases, that is, tillage decreases and the degree of living cover increases, we see the stability increase with our forage systems, and actually our no-till grain systems up in the upper right corner of the graph here. We do think that this has a link to soil health at the trial. Relative perenniality is very strongly associated with aggregation and soil structure. And we believe that over time that aggregation and soil structure helps to attenuate variation associated with kind of non-extreme or ephemeral moisture stress in those cropping systems. When we turn to drought resilience, that is how our systems respond to drought, and we ask those same questions looking at our cropping system kind of management coefficients, we find that the most explanation or kind of the most correlated management metric is actually diversity in the cropping systems. That is, the more crops we have in a rotation, the more likely that rotation is to fare well in a excessively dry year. And there is likely a soil health signal in that. We know that a diversity at WIXT is associated with things like total microbial biomass, active carbon, and soil organic carbon, but probably a stronger signal is the simple idea of a portfolio effect, that the more crops we have in a rotation, the more likely 1 or 2 of those crops are to fare better than others in an extreme year. And actually what we find is that after we've got about 3 crops in the rotation, the kind of drought resilience of a system begins to level off. So here, this is just looking at the response of cropping systems during the 2012 drought in Arlington, with our more diverse systems at or above 100% resilience, just meaning that they're kind of like where we would expect them to be on a normal year. But some of our less diverse systems, continuous corn in particular, really struggling. So just in kind of summary of these details, we do have strong evidence that perenniality, diversity, and living cover improve soil health. We've seen it at WIXT, we've seen it elsewhere. We also know that soil health does play a role in what we're seeing in the system's stability and to some degree in resilience. Maybe not productivity, because the most productive in terms of caloric output systems at the trial are those that are dominated by annual grain crops. Continuous corn is an example. And so I think, that just begs the question, and I think many people here are probably beyond this question, that it's time to move beyond productivity as the gold standard for our agricultural systems and thinking about how we incentivize cropping systems with multiple ecosystem services. Yes, we need output, but also things like stability, resilience, soil health, carbon for the climate, and numerous other things, water purification, et cetera.
when you talk about incentivizing systems, how would you see that? What does that look like?
That's a great question. I was actually hoping you guys would help me answer that. I mean, we do see a lot of talk and a big push for, paying farmers to sequester carbon. This seems to be getting more and more and more attention. There's a lot of work to do before that comes online, but I've in the past I've thought about programs like CRP or CSP, but there needs to be incentives, and I think it's more than just economic incentives. Social incentives would be useful too, just to make it clear that we of course want and need productivity, but there are so many other things that we're looking to our working lands to provide for us, and we need to make it clear that we value those services that farmers help us attain.
Okay, there's a question in the chat box. What are the 3 other parts of the trials? You said there were 9.
Yes, there are 9. 6 are the core cropping systems. We also have 3 perennial grasslands. We have a high diversity prairie, a low diversity prairie, and a switchgrass, a monoculture switchgrass. And because the output from those systems really doesn't fit, if you will, in the context of energy output, we haven't included them. Those systems provide kind of one extreme control. The soils at Wix are mollisols. They formed under prairies, and so having prairies there provides us kind of a biogeochemical or soil health control. At the other end, I would say, is our continuous corn system, where for 31 years we've planted corn and tilled it. And so that really provides kind of a biogeochemical or soil health reference. And I'd be happy to just kind of like talk outside of the context of what I presented today on those systems.
Gene writes, would there be soil health benefits to reincorporating a grazing and cropping system?
Reincorporating, does that mean integrating a grazing and cropping system? I'm going to assume that's what that means, unless something comes up.
Yes, that's what his response was, yes.
Okay. I think absolutely. I mean, annual systems are tricky. We know that there are things that we can do to annual systems to make them better for soil health. I'm sure that this group does a lot of cover crops research. We know that integrating crops and livestock can improve soil health because it necessitates forage crops. It necessitates some return of manure. But grasslands are by far the most beneficial in terms of soil health, primarily because it necessitates a complete lack of tillage while they're in. But then you also have a considerable amount of below ground fine root biomass. And so we often think about permanent pastures, and those could be really well managed pastures, management intensive rotational grazing, being super healthy for the soil. But in Europe, there's a lot of work with grass lays where you do have a temporary rotational pasture that might be in for 2, 3, 4, 5 years, and then we go back into grain crops. And we would expect, whether that pasture is being used as a hay crop or whether it's being used as a grazing crop, for that grass phase to make a considerable impact in things like aggregate stability, microbial biomass, soil carbon. All of those things should come along with that grass presence.
We have another question from Todd. Does this research question whether organic tillage is really a long-term soil health benefit? If you could take a look at that, I'm not quite sure I understand that.
And let me see if I can pull up
in the chat.
I'm not seeing the chat box right now.
Would you want to rephrase your question? I
Yeah.
unmuted your microphone.
Okay. Yes. So if we look at this, I think there's so much of our public that seems to think that organic is the way to go, that are some way, that are paying premiums for organic. But do we have to be really careful about, if we look at some of this, it's showing that there's degrading soil when we're doing tillage. And so a lot of the organic systems have to have tillage in there, but they're probably destroying a lot of the beneficial fungi. And so do we need to re-quantify what's a good soil and what isn't, that way?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think it kind of gets down a little bit to the fact that it's hard to find a system that can do everything we want it to. I think that much of the interest in organics from a consumer standpoint come from the idea of, and I'm not defending or throwing anything under the bus, but the idea that there's potentially less petrochemical inputs in a system like that, so less potential to consume something. But it's absolutely the case that tillage breaks up hyphal networks, it breaks up aggregates, it oxidizes carbon. I haven't talked about it today, but a lot of the research we do at WIXT looks at the long term, and I'm talking 20, 30-year impacts of these systems on soil carbon. And I can tell you that the only systems that we see any kind of progress in the way of building carbon are the systems that are perennial, and even above and beyond that, the systems that are grasslands. That tillage does have a big impact on what we would consider kind of classic soil health metrics. And I think that's why, Aaron Silva and a number of other colleagues in the north central US are trying to figure out how to do no-till or reduced till organic, because they also recognize the importance of keeping that soil stable.
Hey, Greg, there's another question from Dave. Can we have more detail on the difference between perenniality and living color? Is perenniality 100%?
Right. Oh, that's a great question too. So, and perenniality is not a great term. So I would love, maybe even to crowdsource ideas, but living cover is simply, if we take a look at the crop rotation or system, take a look at the system, we look at how long there's green cover on that soil. So we take account how many phases are in the rotation and how long during the growing season we have green cover. And we can calculate a metric of what that living cover is. Perenniality is a term we came up with to kind of say, okay, living cover is one thing, but soil stability is another thing. For example, our organic systems have a lot of living cover because they use cover crops, but they also have a lot of tillage. And so perenniality is a metric where we combine how much living cover we have in a system with how little tillage we have. So more green on the soil and less soil disturbance gives you a higher relative perenniality, which is why we're calling it relative. It's not that it's a perennial system, but it's that soil is more stable and covered for a longer portion of the time. And that's critical. I mean, it is really closely related to those kind of metrics of soil structure, aggregate stability, things that would lead to water stability and water holding capacity.
Okay, very good. We've got one more.
Okay.
How would you set a baseline in regions whose natural covers were hardwood forests as opposed to grassland if similar system assessment was done? Does grassland set the soil health standard too high for such areas' true potential?
Both good questions. I'm going to start with the grassland setting the standard too high for such areas' true potential. I think if you were looking at a forested ecosystem, so you're working with alpha sols or some other forest soil, then you would want to have your kind of native control be a forest. it wouldn't be fair necessarily to compare those to grasslands. From the standpoint of Wixt, and I would say for the standpoint of the vast majority of the Corn Belt, which is dominated by mollisols that developed under the tallgrass prairie, 3,000 or 4,000 years, 5,000 years of tallgrass prairies impact on soil health is kind of, at least in a past climate, was, the steady state that we had reached. And so that would be a high bar for our soil health. If we could get back in that direction. The climate's changing. It's not in steady state now, so that becomes a little bit complicated. But if you were working in a predominantly hardwood forest region, I think you would want to set your, your control or your baseline as forested land. I do think that with agricultural production, particularly if irrigation is involved, you could actually drive soil health indices beyond a forest ecosystem's soil health indices, but that gets complicated too, because then we're talking about irrigation being in the swing.